It was November 1978, and Los Angeles was buzzing with excitement. The city of dreams had just witnessed another success story in the making. A young actress named Diana Whitmore had wrapped up filming on what everyone believed would be her biggest movie yet. At 32 years old, she was finally getting the recognition she deserved after years of smaller roles and bit parts. Diana wasn't an overnight success. She'd spent nearly a decade working her way up through the Hollywood system. She'd done commercials, guest spots on television shows, and supporting roles that barely got her name in the credits. But she never gave up. Those who knew her said she had something special, a spark that the camera loved. And now, finally, that hard work was about to pay off. The wrap party was held at a beautiful home in the Hollywood Hills. Everyone was there, celebrating the end of months of grueling film work. The director was thrilled with how everything had turned out. The producers were already talking about award nominations. Diana's co-stars kept telling her that this was it. This was the role that would change everything for her. She must have felt like she was floating on air that night. People at the party later said Diana seemed happy, genuinely happy. She was laughing, toasting with champagne, thanking everyone who had believed in her. Around 11 o'clock that evening, she said her goodbyes. She hugged her closest friends, promised to call them the next day, and walked out to her car. It was a silver Mercedes, not brand new, but well-maintained. She'd bought it used 2 years earlier when she'd landed a regular role on a television series. The weather that night wasn't great. A thick fog had rolled in from the ocean, the kind that makes the Hollywood Hills feel almost haunted. Visibility was poor, and the winding roads were slick with moisture. But Diana had driven these roads countless times. Her apartment was only about 20 minutes away in West Hollywood. That was the last time anyone saw Diana Whitmore alive. The next morning, a jogger running along Mulholland Drive noticed something odd. A silver Mercedes was parked on the shoulder of the road, its hazard lights blinking weakly. The jogger thought maybe someone had car trouble, but as he got closer, he realized something felt wrong. The driver's door was slightly open. He approached carefully and peered inside. The keys were still in the ignition. A purse sat on the passenger seat, completely undisturbed. There were no signs of any struggle, no broken glass, no blood. Nothing that would explain why someone would just leave their car like this. The jogger immediately called the police. When officers arrived and ran the plates, they discovered the car belonged to Diana Whitmore. They contacted her family and friends, hoping for a simple explanation. Maybe she'd gotten a ride home with someone. Maybe she'd felt sick and called a friend to pick her up. But every call brought the same response. No one had heard from her since the party. Within hours, what started as a routine abandoned vehicle call had turned into a missing person investigation. And as the day wore on and Diana still didn't turn up, that investigation became increasingly urgent. Her mother was the first family member to arrive at the scene. She stood on that foggy roadside, staring at her daughter's car, and she knew immediately that something terrible had happened. A mother's instinct, she would later say. Diana would never just leave her car like this. She would never disappear without telling anyone where she was going. The police launched a massive search operation. This was a Hollywood actress after all, and her disappearance quickly became front-page news. Hundreds of volunteers showed up to help search the rugged terrain around where the car was found. The Hollywood Hills aren't like a city park. They're wild, steep, covered in thick brush and dotted with deep ravines. In some places, the hillside drops off so sharply that one wrong step could send you tumbling hundreds of feet down. Search teams combed through the area for days. Police helicopters flew overhead, their searchlights cutting through the fog at night. Bloodhounds tried to pick up Diana's scent but kept losing the trail. The terrain was just too difficult, too vast, too unforgiving. Every day that passed without finding her made the situation more desperate. Detectives interviewed everyone who had been at the wrap party. Had Diana been drinking? Yes, people admitted she'd had some champagne, but no one thought she was drunk. Had she seemed upset about anything? No, quite the opposite. She'd been in great spirits all evening. Had anyone seen her talking to strangers or noticed anyone following her? Again, no. Everything seemed perfectly normal until she walked out that door and vanished. Theories started flying almost immediately. Some people thought Diana had been kidnapped. Maybe a deranged fan had followed her from the party. Others wondered if organized crime was involved. Hollywood in the late 70s had its share of dark connections. There were even whispers that maybe Diana had staged the whole thing, that she'd wanted to escape the pressures of fame and start a new life somewhere else. But those who knew Diana best dismissed that last theory outright. She'd worked too hard for too long to throw it all away, just when success was finally within reach. And besides, she was close with her family. She had a younger sister who adored her, parents who had supported her dreams from the beginning. She wouldn't put them through this kind of agony. As weeks turned into months, the search continued, but hope began to fade. Diana's face appeared on news broadcasts across the country. Her mother took out an advertisement in the Los Angeles Times that would run every year on the anniversary of her disappearance. The message was simple and heartbreaking. "Diana, please come home. We love you." The case file stayed open, but active investigation slowed as leads dried up. Detective Frank Morrison, the lead investigator, kept Diana's photo on his desk as a reminder of the case he couldn't solve. He would carry that burden for years to come. The film Diana had been working on was released the following year. Critics loved it. They praised her performance, saying she showed depth and range that promised great things to come. It became a huge success at the box office. Diana Whitmore had finally become a star, but she wasn't there to see it. The tragedy of her disappearance only added to the film's mystique, and her performance took on an almost haunting quality knowing what had happened. But where was Diana? What had happened on that foggy November night? The Hollywood Hills held their secrets close, and no one could imagine that it would take 22 more years before those secrets would finally be revealed. The years after Diana's disappearance were cruel in their slowness. Time kept moving forward, but for her family, it felt like they were frozen in that November night in 1978. Every day brought the same questions with no answers. Every phone call made their hearts race, hoping it might be news. Every knock on the door could be the police with information. But the calls and knocks that mattered never came. Diana's mother struggled the most. She couldn't accept that her daughter was simply gone without a trace. She kept Diana's room exactly as it had been, dusting it weekly, changing the sheets monthly as if her daughter might walk through the door at any moment. She attended every support group for families of missing persons. She talked to psychics, even though she'd never believed in that sort of thing before. Desperation makes people reach for any thread of hope, no matter how thin. Her father tried to be strong, but those who knew him said he aged 10 years in the first 12 months after Diana vanished. He'd taken time off work to help with the search, spending weeks hiking through those brutal hills, calling his daughter's name until his voice gave out. When he finally returned to his job at the post office, co-workers said he was a shadow of his former self. Diana's younger sister, Rebecca, was 24 when her sister disappeared. She'd always looked up to Diana, admired her courage to chase her dreams in Hollywood. After the disappearance, Rebecca threw herself into activism. She started volunteering with organizations that helped families of missing persons. If she couldn't find her own sister, maybe she could help someone else find theirs. It became her life's mission, a way to channel grief into something productive. Detective Frank Morrison never stopped thinking about the case. Even as his desk filled with new investigations, Diana's file sat in a special place. He'd pull it out during slow nights, reviewing witness statements for the 100th time, looking for something he might have missed. His wife used to joke that Diana Whitmore was the other woman in their marriage, but there was sadness behind the humor. She could see how the unsolved case ate at him. Morrison had worked hundreds of cases in his career, but this one was different. There was something about finding that abandoned car with no explanation that haunted him. In most missing person cases, there were clues, breadcrumbs to follow. But Diana had simply evaporated. He'd investigated every theory, from kidnapping to voluntary disappearance, and none of them held up under scrutiny. As the years rolled by, the media attention faded. In 1980, Diana's story was occasionally mentioned in true crime magazines. By 1985, it only came up on anniversary specials. The public had moved on to newer mysteries, fresher tragedies. But the people who loved Diana couldn't move on. They were stuck in an endless waiting room, hoping for closure that never came. Diana's parents both passed away in the late 80s, her father in 1987 and her mother in 1989. Neither of them ever learned what happened to their daughter. At both funerals, Rebecca stood by the graves and felt the weight of being the last one left, who remembered Diana as more than just a mystery. She was the keeper of her sister's memory now, The only one who could tell stories about Diana's childhood, her dreams, her laugh. The film that Diana had made, her final role, had become a classic. Film students studied her performance. Critics called it haunting, tragic, brilliant. There was something about knowing she'd disappeared right after filming that gave her scenes an almost supernatural quality. People read meanings into her expressions that probably weren't there. But that's what happens when someone becomes a mystery instead of just a person. In Hollywood, Diana's story became legend. Young actresses would visit the spot where her car had been found, leaving flowers and notes. Some people claimed to have seen her ghost walking along Mulholland Drive on foggy nights. A true crime book published in 1992 dedicated an entire chapter to her case, proposing wild theories involving secret affairs and mob connections. None of it was based on solid evidence, but speculation filled the vacuum where facts should have been. Detective Morrison retired in 1995 after 30 years on the force. At his retirement party, his colleagues presented him with a framed photo of the entire department from 1978, the year he'd taken on the Whitmore case. He hung it in his home office, and sometimes his wife would find him staring at it, still turning the mystery over in his mind. He'd tell her that retiring from the job didn't mean retiring from caring about the cases. The rise of the internet in the mid-90s gave Diana's case new life in an unexpected way. True crime forums popped up where amateur investigators could share theories and information. A website dedicated to unsolved Hollywood mysteries featured Diana's case prominently. People who'd never heard of her before became invested in solving the puzzle. But for all the discussion and speculation, no one came up with anything the police hadn't already considered. Rebecca visited the spot where Diana's car had been found at least once a year. She'd park safely off the road, walk to the approximate location, and just stand there. Sometimes she'd talk out loud, telling her sister about her life, about how much she was missed, about how the world had changed. Other times she'd just be silent, hoping that somehow being in that place might make her feel closer to understanding what had happened. By the late 90s, almost everyone directly involved with the original investigation had retired or moved on. The case was officially cold, though it technically remained open. The police department's files on Diana Whitmore filled 2 large boxes stored in a basement archive. Occasionally, a new detective would pull them out, review them with fresh eyes, but they always reached the same frustrating conclusion. There was simply nothing more to investigate. Every lead had been followed to its end. What no one knew was that nature had been slowly working on revealing the truth. Every winter, rain would fall on the Hollywood Hills. Every summer, the earth would dry and crack. Bit by bit, season after season, the ground was shifting. Deep beneath the brush and rocks where search teams had been unable to reach, something waited to be found. The year 2000 was approaching, and with it would come one of the wettest winters Southern California had seen in decades. El Niño was building in the Pacific, promising storms that would reshape the coastline and hillsides. The Hollywood Hills, with their expensive homes perched on unstable ground, were particularly vulnerable. Nobody could have predicted that a weather pattern forming thousands of miles away would finally solve a 22-year-old mystery. Nobody could have known that sometimes the earth itself becomes the detective, and all it needs is the right conditions to reveal what it's been hiding all along. Diana's story wasn't over. It had just been waiting for the right moment to continue. February 2000 started out like any other month in Los Angeles, but meteorologists were watching the Pacific Ocean with growing concern. El Niño had developed into one of the strongest weather patterns in years, and it was heading straight for Southern California. The predictions were alarming. Forecasters warned of rainfall levels that could exceed anything the region had seen in decades. The first storms hit in early February. Rain pounded the city day after day, turning streets into rivers and overwhelming drainage systems. But it was the Hollywood Hills that faced the greatest danger. For years, developers had built expensive homes on these steep slopes, cutting into the hillsides and removing the natural vegetation that held the soil in place. Now, with the ground completely saturated, those hills were becoming dangerously unstable. Local news stations ran constant warnings. Residents in high-risk areas were told to prepare for possible evacuations. Geologists explained that when soil becomes waterlogged, it loses its ability to grip the underlying rock. Add enough weight from the rain itself, and eventually, gravity wins. The question wasn't if landslides would happen, but where and when. On the night of February 23rd, the rain was particularly fierce. Thunder rolled across the city and lightning lit up the sky. Most people stayed inside watching the storm through their windows. Around 3 in the morning, residents near Griffith Park heard a sound that many later described as similar to a freight train. The ground itself seemed to rumble and groan. A massive section of hillside, weakened by weeks of rain, had finally given way. Thousands of tons of mud, rocks, and debris came rushing down the slope, taking trees and everything else in its path. The landslide was so powerful that it closed a section of Mulholland Drive and several hiking trails in Griffith Park. Fortunately, no homes were in the direct path, and no one was injured. But the damage was extensive. When morning came and the rain finally stopped, the scene was devastating. Where there had once been a steep, brush-covered hillside, there was now a raw wound in the earth. Mud had spread across roads and trails. Massive boulders sat where they'd never been before. Trees lay scattered like matchsticks. It looked like a war zone. The city immediately sent geological survey teams to assess the damage. They needed to determine if more landslides were possible, and whether it was safe to reopen the roads and trails. These teams consisted of engineers and geologists who specialized in soil stability and erosion. Their job was to study the newly exposed hillside and provide recommendations. One of the survey team members was a woman named Patricia Chen. She'd grown up in Los Angeles and had been working in geological surveying for about 5 years. As she carefully made her way across the unstable terrain, taking measurements and photographs, something caught her eye. Partially buried in the mud, glinting in the sunlight, was what looked like jewelry. Patricia carefully approached the spot. Using her gloved hands, she gently cleared away some of the mud. It was definitely a bracelet, and even covered in dirt, she could tell it was old and distinctive. The design was Art Deco style, the kind of jewelry that was popular in the 70s. Something about it seemed familiar, but she couldn't quite place why. That evening, Patricia showed photos of the bracelet to her mother over dinner. Her mother had always been fascinated by unsolved mysteries, particularly those involving old Hollywood. She collected books about famous cases and had folders full of newspaper clippings. When she saw the photo of the bracelet, her face went pale. She disappeared into her office and came back minutes later with an old magazine from 1979. There, in a feature article about Diana Whitmore's disappearance, was a photo of the actress at a movie premiere. On her wrist was an identical Art Deco bracelet. The article even mentioned it specifically, describing it as one of Diana's favorite pieces of jewelry, a gift from her grandmother. Patricia felt her heart start to race. She knew exactly where that landslide had occurred. It was in Griffith Park, not far from where Diana's car had been found all those years ago. The area had been searched in 1978, but it was rugged and dangerous with steep ravines that made thorough searching nearly impossible. Could Diana have been there all along? Just 15 or 20 feet from where her car was found, but hidden in a place too treacherous for searchers to reach? First thing the next morning, Patricia contacted her supervisor. Within hours, the local police were notified. The case might have been 22 years old, but it was still officially open. Detective Morrison had long since retired, but the cold case unit took the call seriously. By afternoon, a team of forensic anthropologists and investigators had arrived at the scene. The excavation had to be done carefully. The area was still unstable from the landslide, and there was always a risk of more debris coming down. But more importantly, if human remains were present, they needed to be recovered properly to preserve any evidence. The team worked slowly, using hand tools and brushes, the same techniques archaeologists use at historical sites. It didn't take long to confirm what everyone was beginning to suspect. Within a few feet of where the bracelet had been found, they discovered human bones. They were deep in what had been an inaccessible ravine, buried under layers of soil and rock that had probably accumulated over the decades. The landslide had exposed what nature had hidden for 22 years. The remains were carefully excavated over the next several days. Every bone was photographed in place before being removed. Soil samples were taken. The entire area was treated as both a recovery site and a potential crime scene. Even though more than 2 decades had passed, the team worked with the same care and respect they would give to any recent case. News of the discovery leaked quickly. Within days, reporters descended on the area. The story of Diana Whitmore, which had been mostly forgotten except by true crime enthusiasts, was suddenly front-page news again. Helicopters flew over the site. News vans lined the nearby streets. Everyone wanted to know if these remains were really Diana, and if so, what had happened to her. Rebecca received the call from the police on a Tuesday afternoon. They explained that remains had been found, and that they would need dental records to make a positive identification. After 22 years of wondering, of hoping, of living in uncertainty, she might finally have answers. She sat in her kitchen after hanging up the phone, crying tears that were equal parts grief and relief. Detective Morrison heard about the discovery on the evening news. He was 78 years old now, retired for 5 years, but the case had never left him. He immediately called the police department, offering to share anything from his files that might help. The current investigators welcomed his input. This was his case in many ways, even though he'd been unable to solve it. The forensic analysis would take time, but everyone involved had a feeling about what they would find. After more than 2 decades, Diana Whitmore might finally be coming home. The Hollywood Hills had kept their secret, but nature itself had decided it was time for the truth to emerge. The forensic analysis took several weeks, but the investigators worked as quickly as they could. They understood that Rebecca and everyone who had loved Diana deserved answers without unnecessary delays. The remains had been exposed to the elements for over 2 decades, which made the process more challenging. But forensic science had advanced significantly since 1978. The first confirmation came through dental records. Diana's dentist from the 70s had long since retired, but his records had been preserved as part of the original missing person investigation. When the forensic odontologist compared the dental X-rays to the remains, the match was unmistakable. After 22 years, Diana Whitmore had been found. Rebecca got the official call on a Thursday morning. Even though she'd been preparing herself for this news, hearing it out loud felt surreal. The police were gentle but direct. They'd found her sister. After more than 2 decades of not knowing, of imagining every possible scenario, the wondering was finally over. Rebecca thanked them, hung up the phone, and sat in silence for a long time. She didn't know whether to feel relieved or heartbroken. Maybe it was both, but identifying the remains was only part of the puzzle. The bigger question remained: what had actually happened to Diana that November night in 1978? Was this a crime scene? Had someone hurt her and hidden her body in that ravine? Or was there another explanation? The investigators needed to find out. The forensic anthropologists examined every bone carefully. They were looking for any signs of trauma, anything that might indicate violence. What they found told a story that was both tragic and surprisingly simple. Several of Diana's bones showed fractures consistent with a severe fall. The pattern of injuries suggested she had fallen from a significant height and landed hard. The investigators went back to the site with this information. They studied the terrain, measured distances, and created computer models of what the hillside would have looked like in 1978. Remember, 22 years of erosion and plant growth had changed the landscape. They needed to reconstruct how it had been the night Diana disappeared. What they discovered made everything clear. The spot where Diana's car had been found was right at the edge of a very steep drop-off. But in 1978, this drop-off had been hidden by thick brush and darkness. On a foggy night with poor visibility, someone standing at the road's edge wouldn't have been able to see the danger just a few feet away. The investigators then requested something that had been preserved in evidence all these years: samples from Diana's car. Specifically, they wanted to test any biological material that might still be viable. Technology had advanced tremendously since the 70s. Tests that were impossible back then were now routine. The results were revealing. Tests showed that Diana's blood alcohol content on the night she disappeared had been well above the legal limit. This didn't mean she was falling down drunk, but she was definitely impaired. Several people at the wrap party had mentioned she'd been drinking champagne, celebrating her success. No one thought she was dangerously intoxicated, but clearly, she'd had more than she should have before driving. Putting all the pieces together, the investigators developed a theory of what happened that night. Diana had left the wrap party and started driving home. At some point along Mulholland Drive, she'd begun to feel sick or disoriented. Maybe the winding roads got to her, or maybe the alcohol hit her harder than she'd realized. She'd pulled over to the shoulder, turned on her hazard lights, and gotten out of the car. Perhaps she'd felt nauseous and needed fresh air. Perhaps she'd felt dizzy and wanted to walk it off before continuing home. Whatever the reason, she'd stepped out into the foggy night. The combination of darkness, fog, alcohol impairment, and unfamiliar terrain proved fatal. She'd walked just a few steps from her car and stepped right off the edge of the ravine. The fall was probably 15 to 20 feet onto rocky ground. Based on the injuries to her skeleton, the forensic team believed she'd died either on impact or very shortly afterward. It would have been quick, which was perhaps the only mercy in the entire tragic situation. The cruel irony was that she'd been so close to the road where hundreds of people had searched for her. But the ravine was so steep and overgrown that searchers in 1978 simply couldn't access it safely. They'd looked, they'd called her name, they'd been just yards away from where she lay, but the terrain had defeated them. Detective Morrison heard the full report from the current investigators. They'd called him out of respect, knowing how much this case had meant to him over the years. When they finished explaining their findings, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that the younger detectives would remember. 22 years, and it was an accident. Just a terrible, senseless accident. It was hard to accept that there was no villain in this story, no crime to solve, no justice to pursue. Diana hadn't been kidnapped or murdered. She hadn't run away or been the victim of some elaborate conspiracy. She'd simply made a decision that millions of people make, a decision to drive after drinking, and it had cost her everything. Then in a moment of bad luck and poor visibility, she'd stepped into darkness. The news media covered the findings extensively. The story that had captivated Los Angeles for over 2 decades finally had its conclusion. Some people found it anticlimactic. After all the theories and speculation, the truth was almost disappointingly simple. But for those who had loved Diana, the simplicity didn't make it any less painful. Rebecca spoke to reporters once just to set the record straight and honor her sister's memory. She explained that Diana had been a good person who'd made a mistake, the same mistake that too many people make. She wasn't a cautionary tale or a mystery to be solved anymore. She was just someone's sister, someone's daughter, a young woman whose life had been cut short by a tragic accident. The toxicology findings about alcohol sparked conversations about drunk driving that echoed across the country. This was the year 2000, and while awareness about drunk driving had improved since the 70s, it was still a major problem. Diana's story was a stark reminder that it only takes one poor decision, one night of impaired judgment to change everything. For Rebecca, knowing the truth brought a strange kind of peace. It wasn't the ending she would have chosen, but at least it was an ending. The not knowing had been torture. Every birthday, every holiday, every time the phone rang, there had been that tiny flicker of hope that maybe Diana was alive somewhere. Now she could finally grieve properly and begin to move forward. Detective Morrison felt something lift from his shoulders that had been weighing on him for 22 years. He hadn't failed Diana. No one had. Sometimes, despite everyone's best efforts, despite hundreds of searchers and thousands of hours of investigation, nature and circumstance conspire to keep secrets, and sometimes it takes nature itself to reveal them again. The funeral was held on a sunny Saturday morning in March 2000, exactly 22 years and 4 months after Diana had disappeared. It should have happened in 1978, but life doesn't always follow the timeline we expect. Rebecca stood at the front of the chapel, looking at the closed casket that held her sister's remains, and felt the weight of all those lost years. The service was attended by people from every phase of Diana's life and disappearance. There were a few former co-stars who had aged visibly since the 70s. Some of Diana's old friends came, many of them crying for the girl they'd known decades ago. Detective Morrison was there, sitting quietly in the back row, his wife beside him holding his hand. He'd worn his old police dress uniform, the one he'd been saving for special occasions. This felt like the right time. Rebecca had spent weeks preparing her eulogy. She wanted to get it right, to honor her sister not just as a mystery that had finally been solved, but as the person she'd actually been. When she stood at the podium, her voice was steady but her eyes were wet. She talked about Diana the little girl, not Diana the actress. She told stories about their childhood, about how Diana used to put on shows in their living room, making Rebecca play all the supporting roles. She talked about Diana's determination, how she'd moved to Los Angeles with just $800 and a dream, and how she'd worked every odd job imaginable while auditioning. She mentioned the calls home, always optimistic, always believing that success was just around the corner. And then Rebecca said something that resonated with everyone in that chapel. She said that Diana's story wasn't really about Hollywood or mystery or tragedy. It was about the fragility of life and how quickly everything can change. One decision, one foggy night, one step in the wrong direction, and a whole life disappears. She said that if Diana's story could save even one person from making the same mistake, from getting behind the wheel when they shouldn't, then maybe some meaning could come from such a senseless loss. After the service, people gathered at a reception. It was strange how funerals bring people together. Former co-workers who hadn't seen each other in years stood in small groups sharing memories. Detective Morrison talked with some of the current investigators who had worked on recovering Diana's remains. There was a sense of closure in the air, bittersweet but real. In the weeks following the funeral, Rebecca couldn't stop thinking about all the families who were still waiting for answers about their missing loved ones. She'd spent 22 years in that awful limbo, and she knew there were thousands of others going through the same thing. She had the financial means to help, having inherited money from her parents and being successful in her own career. More importantly, she had the motivation. That's when she decided to create the Diana Whitmore Foundation. The mission was simple: to support families of missing persons and to fund the kind of technology and techniques that might bring more people home. She remembered how the landslide had revealed Diana's location, how nature had done what human searchers couldn't. But what if there were better tools, better training, better resources for the families left behind? The foundation started small, but Rebecca was determined. She reached out to forensic experts, search and rescue teams, and other missing person advocacy groups. She wanted to learn what was needed most, where the gaps were in the system. The answers were eye-opening. Many search operations were underfunded. Forensic testing was expensive and not always available to families who couldn't afford it. Training for searchers in difficult terrain was limited. Rebecca threw herself into the work with the same energy her sister had once brought to acting. She organized fundraisers, reached out to donors, and spoke at conferences about her family's experience. She became a voice for families who felt forgotten by the system. And people listened. There was something powerful about her story, about waiting 22 years for closure, and then choosing to help others avoid that same pain. One of the Foundation's first major initiatives was funding advanced search technology. Ground-penetrating radar had improved significantly since the 70s, but many search operations couldn't afford it. The Foundation purchased equipment and provided training, making it available to search teams across California. They also funded cadaver dog programs and supported the development of better mapping technology for difficult terrain. But Rebecca knew that technology alone wasn't enough. She also established a support network for families of missing persons. She understood from personal experience how isolating that situation could be, how people didn't know what to say, how the uncertainty ate away at you day after day. The Foundation connected families with counselors, support groups, and resources for managing the practical and emotional challenges of having a loved one missing. Something unexpected happened in late 2000. A film studio approached Rebecca about re-releasing Diana's final movie. It had been over 20 years since its original theatrical run, but the renewed interest in Diana's story had created demand. The studio wanted to do a special edition release with remastered sound and picture. They offered to donate a significant portion of the proceeds to the Diana Whitmore Foundation. Rebecca had mixed feelings about this. Part of her worried it was exploiting her sister's death, but another part recognized it as an opportunity. The foundation needed funding to continue its work, and this could provide substantial support. Plus, it would allow a new generation to see Diana's performance, to remember her for her talent rather than just her tragic end. She agreed with conditions. The marketing couldn't sensationalize Diana's death. There would be a dedication in the credits mentioning the foundation and its mission, and Rebecca would write a message in the special edition materials talking about her sister and about the importance of making responsible decisions. When the film was re-released in early 2001, it was surprisingly successful. Critics revisited Diana's performance and found it just as powerful as they had in 1979. But now, audiences watched with a different perspective. They saw the talent, the potential, the life that had been cut short. And many of them, after watching the film, chose to contribute to the foundation. Detective Morrison lived to see the foundation's early success. Rebecca had invited him to join the advisory board, and he'd accepted immediately. He attended every meeting until his health began to fail. In his final conversation with Rebecca just weeks before he passed away in 2003, he told her that he'd made peace with the case finally. He said that what she was doing, turning tragedy into something that could help others, was the best possible outcome from such a painful situation. Over the years, the Diana Whitmore Foundation helped bring closure to dozens of families. They funded searches that located missing persons. They provided financial assistance for forensic testing. They created educational programs about safety and risk awareness. Each person found, each family reunited, felt like a small redemption of Diana's story. Rebecca often thought about that November night in 1978 and how different things might have been if just one variable had changed. If the fog had been lighter, if Diana had called a cab, if she'd stayed at the party a little longer. But she'd learned that you can't live in the world of what-ifs. You can only work with what is. Diana's grave in Forest Lawn Memorial Park became a quiet place of reflection. People still visited, leaving flowers and notes. But the tone had changed over the years. Instead of mystery and speculation, there was acknowledgement and remembrance. The headstone bore simple words, Diana Whitmore, beloved daughter and sister. Her light lives on. And it did live on. Not in the way anyone would have chosen, but in the work the foundation did, in the families it helped, in the lives it touched. Diana had wanted to make an impact through her acting. Instead, her legacy became about bringing people home, about supporting those left behind, about preventing others from making the same fatal mistake. Rebecca understood something now that she couldn't have grasped at 24. Sometimes closure doesn't look like what you expect. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment but about purpose. And sometimes the only way to honor someone you've lost is to help make sure others don't suffer the same fate. The Hollywood Hills still stood as they always had, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. But now, when people drove along Mulholland Drive on foggy nights, some of them thought of Diana Whitmore. And maybe, just maybe, they made better choices because of it.